Hi, welcome back to another edition of the Michigan Lacrosse Journal. My name is Greg Norman, your host. We are lucky enough to have with us today Dave Halstead, who is the technical director for NOCSAE. You may not be familiar with that organization, but it is the nonprofit company and organization that certifies and makes sure that equipment for lacrosse and a variety of sports are safe. We have goaltenders this year have to have NOCSAE approved chest protectors, NOCSAE approved helmets, balls. And we keep hearing from parents and from outside agencies, sporting good companies, that NOCSAE is only there to help sport companies make more money. And we wanted to kind of dispel the myth. We've had a chance to talk with Billy Bing, who is the Warrior Research and Development Director. We talked about the process of how equipment's made. Now we want to talk about the certification and have you get a better understanding for the certification, making sure that it's pretty healthy. We had a chance to talk to Dave down in Tennessee, where his organization and his company are located. And we want to explore a little bit about NOCSAE. And I think you're going to be really surprised at what the educational process is, what the technical process is, and just a little bit about an organization that I think does a great job and maybe as misunderstood as any organization in sports, short of maybe the MHSAA or the NCAA. But take a look at this with Dave and pay attention, because I think you're going to find some really interesting information and it may change your mind, because it certainly did mine. Stay tuned.
We're talking with Dave Halstead, who is the technical director for the National Operating Committee on Standards for Athletic Equipment. Now, the reason my eyes are rolling a little bit as I'm reading it, because I don't want to get the name mixed up, but the term we're referring to is NOCSAE. And Dave, my first question, we always start off the Michigan Lacrosse Review with a very simple question. NOCSAE sometimes has a public relations issue because people just don't know what it is. And we have to go to a system right now where kids are having to buy more equipment, and because it's got to be certified. What is exactly, kind of make in a short-term layman's position, explain to me what NOCSAE is, and so parents could understand it.
Sure. So NOCSAE is made up of a board of volunteers. They come from a wide range. There are many physicians. There are some neurosurgeons. There's orthopedic surgeons. There's cardiac guys. There are athletic trainers. There are coaches. There are equipment makers. They make up the smallest percentage because NOCSAE is an ANSI, American National Standards Institute, accredited standard setting body. So we establish standards where we believe standards are required. And where that comes from is the epidemiology, the research of how often does this happen? Why does it happen? Do we understand enough about why it happens to intervene and prevent it from happening? And if we do, then we would establish a standard which is published and free for anybody to go onto the website and download it and read it. It'll be quite detailed as a general rule. Our concept is to be not design restrictive. So any way you can meet the requirement is fine with us. It's also to be a standard in our minds. If it was translated into, Swedish, the Swedish test lab ought to be able to determine if the thing works just as well as any other lab. So there's a lot of kind of technical jargon that we try to boil down to real specific pieces of information. Like if you're going to hit a chest protector with a lacrosse ball, one of the big challenges is exactly what are the properties of the lacrosse ball, for example.
Yeah.
So we establish these standards when there is a demonstrated epidemiology of two things. A, the event happens. B, we think we understand it well enough to intervene.
The current situation is we've got all kinds of parents going out to buy, and goalies have to buy chest protectors, which are new for 2021, and for 2022 they'll have to have the NOCSAE symbol. Most rules, especially at the high school level, occur for safety, and it's as simple as that. And sometimes parents will try to apply a professional NFL rule to a college NFL rule to a high school rule, and they're changed because of safety. And you're really kind of in charge of that safety. Is that a fair statement?
I think that is a fair statement. Safety is a big word. I've testified for 8 hours on what it means. So it can get really complicated, right? But basically what we're talking about here is, in this case, we're talking about this event, commotio cordis, or sudden cardiac arrhythmias caused by impacts to the chest wall. They turn out to be impacts over the cardiac silhouette. They turn out to be submaximal most of the time, which is very interesting. In other words, A slower impact is more likely to cause this event, where a very high speed impact might actually break a rib or damage some tissue. And you might even think of the breaking rib as a fuse that prevents this electrical kerfuffle that we call commotio cordis that causes your heart to stop. And without an AED, even with Johnny on the spot, expert medical first aid, CPR, the chances of recovery is very, very low. With an AED, the chances are significantly higher. You can reverse this electrical disturbance in the heart with an AED. So we learned that early on. Animal models were used, trying to figure out exactly what caused this. A million questions about how this is caused. How do you intervene? It was occurring in baseball players wearing chest protectors that were thought to be very effective, yet they were still dying from commotio cordis. So the research, without getting too complicated, was farmed out to a large degree to Tufts University and Wayne State University. Again, this is the epidemiology part. Does it really happen? And then some animal studies were done to see if we could replicate the actual event in a laboratory. And if we could replicate it, we could then learn exactly what's causing it. And once we could replicate it, we thought, okay, what's the intervention? And bunches of chest protectors were tested at the time, and none were effective against this, which was kind of interesting. So we then built a human surrogate, which is the next step. So you have to have something to test this on. So we created a human surrogate with load transducers, force transducers, if you will. And we were able to establish the criteria where if the chest protector prevented the load from being transferred to the load transducer, the chances are that it would be about 95+% effective in preventing this electrical kerfuffle of the heart.
If I buy a chest protector, your standards of a 8-year-old body is different than a 12-year-old body is different than a 16-year-old body. Yet the standard is all the same. So if I hit a 16-year-old developed body, it's going to hurt less than an 8-year-old body, given the same impact. Is that fair?
Well, the chest wall is not quite like our shoulders or other muscles that can be very massive, right? But yes, okay, to some degree, it's very interesting that it doesn't happen very often in females. And that might be because females generally have a higher interstitial fat content, and that might be somehow protective. Okay. So maybe muscles aren't necessarily the best solution to this. But yes, generally speaking, the larger you are, the more force it would take to do it. I think the oldest person that commotio cordis has occurred in was about 42 years old. But the data clusters somewhere between the ages of 10 and 14. Okay. That's where most of these events occur.
So I know that the standard that we're talking about, the mother who just bought a chest protector for a 9-year-old is going to be safe, because the standard doesn't qualify for just a 16-year-old, if that makes any sense.
No, you're exactly right. In fact, it qualifies for the most likely candidate to have it, which is the 10-year-old. And then as you go up in size, which presumes you're going up in age, that's not always true. I have a kid who played lacrosse as a goalie. His nickname was Moose, and he was a moose. So even at a young age, he was a pretty big guy. So we try to take that all into account, and the standard actually requires that you have an area of protection and you specify the size of the protector so that the area of protection is large enough to protect the cardiac silhouette in that size that person is, no matter what their age is.
So then if the baseline is for the most obvious potential, then obviously kids up the line are safer, because the line is at near the bottom in terms of safety.
Correct. We want to prevent the worst case scenario, and that means if you're not the worst case scenario, you're going to be better off. That's true.
Well, welcome back to another edition of Michigan Lacrosse Review. My name is Greg Norman. We're lucky enough to have with us here for show 41, Dave Halstead, who is the technical director for, and I got to keep looking at this, the National Operating Committee on Standards for Equipment, Athletic Equipment, which, Dave, I'm going to take you all the way back and just kind of walk through a little bit of history of NOCSAE and why it's a program, and just talk a little bit about the history before we get into the methodology, if we could.
I'd be glad to.
The program started in '69. You guys came out, I think, in '73 with your first, more or less, your tests and your certifications and those kind of things. And it started with football. Is that correct?
It did. In 1968, I don't ask me to quote the number, but I'm thinking it was 34 football players died on the field, and they died from head injuries. And the question was, clearly the helmets aren't working. I think at the time there was consideration of a presidential mandate to ban the sport of football. And so the NCAA and the National Federation of High Schools and some other governing bodies play a role here. It's the governing body who tells you have to wear a NOCSAE certified product, not NOCSAE. NOCSAE doesn't care who wears it. It's up to the governing body. So they got together and said, how are we going to save football? And I'm paraphrasing very loosely here. I was involved in the 80s, but not back in that time. But Dr. Voigt Hodson was. And Dr. Voigt was one of my mentors. And what happened was, it's like we got to have a standard for these helmets. We had helmets that were very effective. Remember the old football helmets that had straps in them that were riveted to the shell? Very effective energy manager until a rivet breaks. And then a completely non-effective energy manager. And Dr. Hodson's view was, in order to actually know if you're protecting a human head, you need to have a reasonably good human surrogate. So the first couple of years were to develop a head form that responded like a human head form. Many test methods use a standard piece of magnesium for the head. A motorcycle helmet, it's a head-shaped hunk of magnesium. It's very nice because it's very repeatable, but it doesn't help you understand the onset of less than dead injuries. And so that became an important attribute to NOCSAE, and still the most advanced biofidelic head form in the world. And in this case, we're talking about today, the most advanced chest surrogate in the world are NOCSAE designs, if you will. So the folks got together around the table, and it was like, well, if we had a helmet that had these attributes, the standard was established. If we had a helmet that had these attributes, and everybody who made them agreed to test them, and everybody who tested them agreed that they would do the quality control necessary to make sure every one of them they made worked, we probably won't have 34 kids die on the high school field next year. And so in 1973, that standard went in effect. And sure enough, the death rate in football started to plummet. The broken neck rate, however, started to increase because kids were using this helmet, which was now a very reliable and comfortable piece of equipment, as a weapon. They could actually do more damage to their opponent by putting their head down. But sadly, if they put their head down to the point where there's no curvature to the neck, you've created what engineers call a segmented column. The helmet would stop, the head would stop, and the head would be very comfortable that it stopped, but the torso would keep coming. So the best example I can give for that is, let's make believe you have a Volkswagen Beetle and you're towing your camping trailer, and you got a nice little trailer hitch, and you run into the car in front of you, and the front bumper on the VW is doing just what it's thinking it should do, and you're sitting in this there with the steering wheel going, man, my bumper's great, this is all good, until that trailer hitch comes and eats the back of your head from the back of that Volkswagen, because our neck was the weak link. So that's when we started, not so much a standard, but a push to play what you may have heard, heads up football. By keeping your head up and seeing what you hit, you avoid that circumstance where you might fracture your neck.
I played high school football in the late 60s and in college football in the early 70s. And your point of the neck injuries, I think back to all the pictures, if you can imagine the Oakland Raiders back in the 70s. Everybody had the old neck rolls to compensate for the helmets that they used as weapons. And if you go back to some of those players, they were spears, and spearing became a rule that you couldn't do it. You couldn't spear anymore. And everything is cyclical. And doing some research for this, Wilson and Rydell, at the time, the two biggest helmet makers, were basically looking at the idea they didn't need the publicity for having kids die with equipment that wasn't certified. And one of the things that NOCSAE, I think, helped was, first of all, let's point out that NOCSAE is a nonprofit organization that is funded through copyright and through licensing fees. Am I correct?
You are correct.
And it's not a governing body or a reciprocal body or a working hands in hands with the sporting industry. You're a legitimate organization that tests stuff to make sure kids are safe and equipment.
That's 100% correct. And when the committee that establishes standards votes, the manufacturers are allowed at the table. They have 2 votes. There are 18 others.
When NOCSAE took off was probably then the early 80s, because it became you guys picked up about 24 sports, I think, by 1980, 1982. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I don't know what the number is, but yes, we have standards for multiple sports: soccer shin guards, baseball headgear, baseball catcher's gear, face protectors, a wide variety. I don't think there's probably 24 standards, but I don't know that there's 24 different actual sports. Although we just picked up polo, which is an interesting sport from a head injury standpoint.
The reason we're having this conversation to explain the sort of the process and what NOCSAE is, I came out of the ski racing world, and when we went from long skis, if you can remember, they were over our heads, to short skis. The reality to it was, in a relatively short order, ski manufacturers want skis to turn as fast as possible. Well, what we found out was, within 3 to 5 years, is that the skis turned really fast, but the bodies that were turning them did not have the physical capacity to be able to turn them. So the skis needed to go longer. And it made sense, because the injuries that were coming from knees and hips and ankles was incredible. So FIS made the determination that they needed to go back to a longer ski, and it wasn't prompted by ski manufacturers wanting to sell more skis. And so part of our conversation with you is kind of explaining to parents that the reason that NOCSAE is in place is so their kids don't die, obviously, but more importantly, there's a standard and they follow through, and that this kind of makes some sense. So take us through just a little bit of the chest protector, because this is new for this year, and how what you kind of looked at from the start to the beginning, and how that process works.
Yeah, so there was a 10-year process, believe it or not. There was reports of commotio cordis, or sudden cardiac arrhythmias. I'll never forget, the first report I read was rather heartbreaking. We had a grandma in Alabama playing pitch and catch with her 6-year-old in the backyard. And I'm here to tell you, grandma's not burning them in. And the kid gets hit in the chest, and he falls down, and he cannot be resuscitated. And that resonated with me. And as a medical first responder myself in an earlier life, I'm like, what do you mean resuscitation didn't work? What's that all about, right? I mean, resuscitation should work. And for those of you old enough to remember, and I am not condoning this, but just for those of you early enough to remember, back in the day, if you witnessed a cardiac arrest, you would deliver something called the precordial thump, the big fist to the chest, right?
Right.
They no longer teach that, because people were using that whether they witnessed the arrest or not, and they were causing more damage than necessary. But it turns out that in commotio cordis, that might actually have helped, because it was a witnessed arrest. The heart was in ventricular fibrillation or in cardiac block. The electrical potential was still there. So maybe that would have worked. Of course, we don't recommend that, but we did almost immediately start recommending AEDs, because an AED on the field in the hands of a coach who knows how to use it can reverse this. And there's been several cases where that has occurred. Meanwhile, the question was, what exactly is happening? And we had all kinds of theories. There was a professor from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, a very highly respected university engineering program, who thought that there might be a vapor locking event, because the blood is 90% water. Water boils at 100 degrees. The heart's pulling a vacuum on it. The body is at 98. I mean, could we be vapor locking the heart like you did an old carburetor? And so much work was done to try and figure it out. And what we figured out was that if you've ever looked at an electrocardiogram, if you will, the kind of squiggly lines, right? So the big one is the T wave. And during that repolarization event, where the heart is gathering up its electrical potential, if an impact occurs within a few milliseconds of that, it can stop the heart. Now, the reason it happens in children more than adults is because you and I, old guys sitting around here, we probably have heart rates, especially if we're still halfway active, sitting here having this conversation, probably in the 60s, maybe the 70s. A kid, especially a little kid, will have a heart rate of 120 most of the time. So he's got a higher heart rate, which means the opportunity for this to occur is much greater. So the ball has to hit you. at that time of T wave repolarization. So it's a timing issue, and it's more likely to happen with littler kids because they have a higher heart rate. And so it can happen at that inopportune time, because that inopportune time happens 100 times a minute instead of 60 times a minute. So we finally figured all of that stuff out, and we had some animal models, and we were able to demonstrate that the chest protectors, be it baseball or lacrosse, that were in use at the time were not effective at preventing this. But you really couldn't use animal models for a standard, because guess what? No two animals are the same, and the word standard is really important to us. So we developed over the next few years, through the help of Wayne State University, we developed a human surrogate that actually simulates this event, and it uses force transducers, and we use a ball propelling device, and we then did some testing, interestingly enough, with the animal models and with our surrogate. And when our surrogate said that the device was working, the animals didn't die. And when our device said it's not working, the animals died. That to me is the kind of proofing that you have to do to say, okay, this is what it takes. So none of the available chest protectors, and none is a big word. There might have been one somewhere that we didn't get our hands on that might have worked, but none of them worked. And it required a significant amount of effort on behalf of the manufacturers. So when the governing body came along and said, we got to put these in effect right away, we said, well, that may not be as easy as you think. This is going to require a lot of retooling, remanufacturing, rethinking this, because you have to cover the cardiac silhouette, which doesn't grow as fast as the rest of us does, which is kind of a challenge. Your heart is about the size of your fist. So your fist grows when you grow, but not as much as, say, the length of your femur or other things. So it's a relatively small target, and it's a target that's not wildly different in a 10-year-old than it is a 16-year-old, but it is different. So we came up with a standard that requires the protector to prevent commotio cordis in our laboratory and to cover the area intended to cover for the size that the protector is. And so people started making these products, and they don't have to be incorporated in a shoulder pad. I think that's an important point. You could buy a shoulder pad that says it meets the NOCSAE standard. That means that manufacturer has proven that shoulder pad, as offered for sale, meets the requirements of the standard. There are devices more popular in baseball than lacrosse, which are just a commotio cordis protector. It would have the logo on it. So the standard says the logo must be on the critical component that does the job. So if the critical component can be separated from the shoulder pad, then that critical component won't be there, and the NOCSAE logo won't be there. So if you just bought a shoulder pad, it's not one that meets the NOCSAE standard. Your child is not protected, and is not using a device that will likely prevent this. Therefore, you need one that meets that standard. Does it happen every day? No, but it only has to happen to one child for you to recognize that it can happen, and you can prevent it. So why not?
Yeah, we're talking to you, I believe, from Tennessee.
That's right.
And you've been with NOCSAE a long time. What's been the biggest change? That obviously the data and what we're looking at has changed because science has gotten better and so on and so forth. I think if kids walking out, they buy an old helmet, then they spray paint it with lead-based paint, and then we tell them, by the way, you can't play with that helmet because there's a possibility you may die. And then the parents get mad because they don't want to spend, they don't want to spend the extra $50 to buy something that keeps them safe. I don't have a problem with that. I sit next to a number of people with USL committees in the summertime and talk to some of the best brain surgeons and neurosurgeons from Johns Hopkins, and they tell me all the time what they don't know about concussions. So that's been the process of understanding it. And all the guys that, used to play for their coaches and sort of, shrugged it off and your bell was rung. I never bought that theory even then. And if you don't know who your name is, you might want to be considered. So is the sporting good industry that supplies the equipment and to some extent the funding, are they an adversary or are they a cooperative partner?
They're both. They're both. They want their products to work. They want demanding standards that will help them demonstrate their products work. On the other hand, every time you set out to write a standard, they know they're going to have to retool. and they don't want to retool. They don't want to spend that kind of money. They don't want to admit by de facto that the product they had didn't work. And now there's one that meets the standard, and it is a challenge. And concussions are very interesting. You know, we could spend hours talking about it. It is really one of my areas of expertise, and we don't know enough about it to know what causes it. We know certain impacts are more likely to cause it than others, but it's incredibly challenging. This, by comparison, is significantly more straightforward, the commotio cordis. But, you know, you're exactly right. And as helmets get bigger, you know, one of my pet peeves is people will put protective covers on the outside of the helmet. You know, the more you put on the outside of the helmet, the more you might reduce direct impact, but the more you might induce rotational accelerations, which are the primary cause of concussion. So sometimes, you know, and I completely get it when parents are like, man, I just spent a lot of money on this thing. What do you mean it doesn't work? But I'll tell you what I go back to in baseball. When we first started with baseball helmets that had to meet the standard, a parent wouldn't think twice of spending $150 on a bat that they thought was going to help their kid get a better RBI average. A parent wouldn't think twice about buying that $400 catcher glove so that maybe their catcher does just a little bit better. And those new Nike running shoes that are made for baseball, you get an extra half a second going to first base, but pay more than $9.95 for a helmet, something's wrong. And the reason for that is because the event doesn't happen that often. So you think to yourself, well, he's running the base all the time. He's swinging the bat all the time. He's catching the ball all the time. How often does he get hit in the head? Well, if you don't have the right helmet, it only takes once. But it doesn't happen that much, so that we discount it.
You've been with NOCSAE since 1985. Am I correct on that?
I believe that's right. Yep.
So that's 35 years, give or take.
Yeah, thanks for the memories. Yep.
What's the question I want to ask? I guess what I want to ask is, does science keep up with innovation, or does it sort of it's lackey and follow? Does the innovations from the sporting world and you're just kind of chasing it, or is there some proactivity to NOCSAE?
Boy, that's great. You know, we think we're very proactive epidemiologically. And so that is, how often does this happen? We fund a lot of research, like the Rio study, and there's some studies that, you know, athletic trainers do, the NCAA does. You know, what happens and how often does it happen? You know, that whole epidemiology thing, you know, how often does it happen? And now more finite. Does it happen to a certain group? Does it happen to a certain subset? Why does it happen to that certain subset? So we think we got a pretty good handle on that, although you always wish you had more information. The minute you start down the path of establishing a standard, it's kind of a slippery slope, because the football helmet standard, you know, the pass fail for catastrophic injury is 1,200 severity index units, which I won't trouble you with the mathematical computation, but it's a weighted impulse time criteria. 1,200 is the number. Helmets today test somewhere around 400,
okay,
which is significantly better. Yet we haven't changed the standard to 400, because 1,200 is all it takes to keep you from getting, I'm going to use the slang term DRT, dead right there. So if you're less than 1,200, not going to be dead right there. But in an effort to try and curb concussions, helmets have gotten significantly better on all the measured tests. Yet the concussion rate has not changed appreciably, which means we don't understand it well enough to establish a standard for concussions. Right. Although we've established standards for rotational acceleration. So the short answer to your question is I think we do a great job on trying to understand what's happening. I think the science starts the standard, and then I think manufacturers get ahead of that, sometimes with great success. I'm not suggesting they shouldn't, but sometimes they get ahead of that with great success, but sometimes they get ahead of it where you really haven't made a difference, but you do have a better product on the test, but the test isn't testing for exactly that subset of injuries, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So I think always having more epidemiology and then trying to tie that to the actual causation is the $1 million scientific question. And I can remember when this whole thing started way back when with helmets, you know, Peter Snell was a race car driver and he got killed, and the guy was following him around the track, Dr. Snively or Snyder. I may get it wrong, and I should be shot for getting that wrong because I should know that. But he was a neurosurgeon, and when he saw the injury and he saw the way the helmet was built, he was like, this is crazy. We need a standard. And he started the Snell Memorial Foundation, and their science was based on how tall the ceiling was. How high are we going to hit it? Well, we can only hit from 10 feet, so let's hit from 10 feet and figure out what happens. So we've come a really long ways from that.
Right.
But we now are in the age of finite element modeling, where we try to look at all of the structures of the brain, and then we do impacts, and we feed those impacts into a computer, and we hope that computer tells us what the shears and strains and stresses and all the dynamics are. And all we know for sure is that those finite element models are lacking. They're great tools, but they're lacking. We just don't know enough about some of this stuff.
I think it's fair to say we don't understand NOCSAE. We're going to get a pretty good education today from listening to it. In talking with a college coach who owns a sporting goods store in Grand Rapids, Michigan yesterday, his first complaint was, well, they randomly come pick ball 800 and ball 1200 on the line and do some tests on it. And if it doesn't work, they change it and they've got to retool. And I said, yeah, but the problem with it is if it turns out the ball 803 is not the right ball and hits the kid in the right place, you may lose the kid. And
you are 100% correct.
It has to be random so that the process works. And it's so easy now to talk to kids to make sure. My deal is if you play when you're hurt and I find out that you lied to me about how much you're hurt, I'll break your other leg. And that's obviously a metaphorical statement, but I want to make sure that the kids are safe.
Right.
When I talk to these doctors about the concussion thing, and I've become more than an advocate, they don't know what in the brain buckets. They don't have any clue. And I had a professional father play professional hockey, and dad had probably 50 concussions. So his son didn't have a problem with telling the coach to go blow it out with his nose if his head got hit. Because dad knew dad didn't have any medical background, but he knew that what had happened to him playing hockey for 20 years, there was a residual effect. And I think of boxing is the best example of that. How many professional boxers did we see in the 70s and 80s that couldn't hold a conversation? And where's boxing today? And I think it's that same process.
It is. And, you can go back to the Roman times. I think the term they used was dementia pugilistica, right? You were demented from being punched. I think there's some very valid concerns about that. But you said something earlier that I want to go back to is there are standards on lacrosse balls now.
Yeah.
Because we have standards on lacrosse helmets. And interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, we had 3 skull fractures. Boom, boom, boom. 3 skull fractures, different helmets. And we started looking at the balls, and the balls were significantly stiffer than they needed to be. There was no standard on the balls. And so the way NOCSAE works is we sat down with the lacrosse manufacturers, the ball manufacturers, the helmet manufacturers. Sometimes they're the same, sometimes they're not. We said, look, we got to control the mechanical properties of the ball here. Because if you don't control the mechanical properties of the ball, we will simply use a cue ball to test the helmets. And once we use a cue ball to test the helmets will get significantly different. And we're not sure that's a good plan. But if you can't control the ball, we have no choice to do that because the ball is an integral part of this event, whether it's commotio cordis or head injury or facial injury. If the ball is too soft, it'll extrude through the openings. If the ball is too hard, it will stress the equipment more than it should. And if the ball is not somewhere in the right range, players don't want to play with it. So it became an interesting standard. And you need to know that NOCSAE standards, with rare exception, demand an incredibly high quality control formulation. Statistical process control, acceptance lot sampling, very critical. And it turned out before our standard, lacrosse balls were all over the place. In addition, you have governing bodies that I think there's a weakness to the governing bodies, and that is that you must wear certified equipment when in play, not necessarily in practice. And there were practice balls, the old shiny, practice balls that were aged and hard, and all of a sudden the equipment's not effective against them, because they are now outside of the parameters where the equipment is tested. So it all works together.
The high school that I started coaching at 19, at the end of the football field, there's a swamp. And every year at the end of the year, the previous coach goes out and does a swamp hunt. So there's 3 complete buckets of balls. Now, a bucket of balls, a 5-gallon pail of balls is probably about a case, and you're talking a couple $100. Now, if you look down into the bucket between the yellows and the white balls, they're a variety of colors, mostly brown and black.
Mhm.
And I had mentioned that I have an old scrubber that we had basically gotten rid of. You put the old balls in and scrub them up. Well, the reality to it was we threw all the balls away because they weren't safe.
Right.
What
That's
we've
true.
even learned from the scrubber is it's buy a new ball. It's just easier because the reality to it is that the shinies, as you point out. So then the fun part about it was we let the kids relaunch the balls to see how far they could throw them, because behind the swamp, it goes for 3 miles. And I'm sure that there's some pollution back there from rubber balls in the swamp that we threw them back in, but that's kind of the nature. We just purchased 50 new Warrior helmets because it's easy to tell parents now that, by the way, bad things can happen to your kid. And I think that's kind of part of it. One of the things that I think is important for people to understand is that about 75-80% of the monies that you guys raise as an organization go to research and development. And I think that's something that gets lost in the translation.
I think you're right. And I want to be really clear. It goes into the research and development of standards, not of products. We do not support any product development of any kind.
Okay. How many folks work for NOCSAE? I'm curious.
Well, I think, Southern Impact Research Center is my company, and we work for NOCSAE, if you will. We have a contract to do their technical directing, so to speak, which includes maintenance of the standards and answering technical questions and helping with the development. There is an executive director who is responsible for, his name is Mr. Mike Oliver. He happens to be an attorney. He's very impassioned about NOCSAE. I think he's fundamentally given up the practice of law to be NOCSAE's executive director. He has an assistant, and I think there is one more, and that's the research director, and that is Dr. Fred Mueller, and he's the guy who's mostly searching for this epidemiology and is reviewing all of the folks who send us proposals. They'll send a proposal. We think we can get better information about youth concussions in flag football. And here's how we're going to design our study, and we'd like you to fund the study. And he's the guy, challenged with, is this a good study? Is this worth funding? Is it worth recommending to NOCSAE? So there's a very small number of people that actually work for NOCSAE, and NOCSAE is a relatively small part of our income. It basically covers the expenses because I think everybody's pretty much voluntary. All of the members of the board of directors are voluntary positions. They get compensated for their travel, not their time, but for their travel expenses to come to meetings. So there's a very small, the executive director, his assistant, the technical director, the research director. I guess those are the 3. And when you say those are the 3, that I have a team here. I have the title technical director, but I have a team that works on this stuff for me and with me.
You mentioned technical director. You said before we had started the interview, you had a previous title that was very descriptive, and I forget what that term was.
Yeah, at one point, my position was called principal investigator.
Okay.
And that's a kind of an academic term for somebody who's in charge of the research. And I think that term may more apply to Fred Mueller. At one time, in all fairness, and I was one of the guys who asked that we switch this up, Dr. Voigt Hodgson, my mentor, and just a wonderful individual, he did it all. He was the research, director. He was the technical director. He was the principal investigator. So it felt a little weird as a manufacturer who was on the NOCSAE board at the time. It felt a little weird to say, wait a minute, the guy who's studying the problem is the same guy who's writing the standard, and it's the same guy who's telling me what I have to do. That seems a little incestuous to me. It seems like maybe the guy who's studying the problem shouldn't be the guy who's trying to solve the problem. And maybe the guy who writes the standard, maybe there should be a little separation there. And NOCSAE thought that was a good idea. And even Dr. Voigt Hodgson thought that was a good idea. But when he started in 68, it was a one-man operation. There wasn't any money. And so that's when that changed.
Dave, is your background medical or engineering?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. I have a lot of training as a paramedic. I have some military background in that area. And Uncle Sam finally sent me to school. So I'm a little of each. which is an interesting combination for this job.
So my follow-up to that, the interesting question I want to ask you is, and it kind of fits. You have a research process and a standards process that you're working with. And part of that formula also has to be litigation, because, the whole point of being certified is to minimize, to some extent, I would think, manufacturers, litigation when it's the lady who spills the coffee on her lap and gets $6 million from McDonald's. I think that has to be part of that formula and discussion. And anybody that would say it's not is really kind of foolish. So where does the line go between the research and the litigation, or is it, maybe explain to us as laymen so we understand?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because it's a catch-22. It truly is a catch-22. If you come out with a product, there's no standard on, and you make a claim about the product, and somebody still has it happen. Let's say it works 80% of the time. You got a device that, I don't know, protects. I'm making something up. You got a device that if you wear it on your face, going to keep you from getting a broken nose in basketball, just hypothetically. There's no standard on it, but you did some testing in your lab and you sell it as, we think this will prevent broken noses. And maybe it does prevent most of them, but a guy gets his nose broke and now he sues you. And you have only your own work to stand on. And that's really a problem. Of course, you're going to tell us it works. Of course, you're going to come in here and explain to these jurors who don't know a nose protector from a teaspoon, that this is, it works. Why should we trust you? This is a crock of crap. So having a standard that was developed independent, that is actually challenging for you to meet, that you actually kind of bitch about because, wow, this thing's really, you're making me change all my product. Well, this is what it takes to meet the standard. I mean, we're not telling you how to make your product, but this is what it has to do. That's beneficial if there's a litigation. So it's really a catch-22. You can look at it either way. If you fail to meet the standard and you claim you met the standard, that's a problem for you.
Right.
If you do meet the standard and the event still happens, it's still a problem for you, but at least the standard is a defense. That we meet the standard that represents the state-of-the-art science in preventing this kind of event. It still happens, but it happens less than 4% of the time, and this is one of those 4%. Doesn't make those parents feel any better. Probably doesn't keep you from losing money, but at least it shows that you are intellectually and morally in the right place. We're trying to do this the right way.
Did some of that discussion, now 2015 SEI came on board, which is an independent certifier. Is that I'm not sure exactly. Talk a little bit about SEI and how that.
Sure.
In 2015.
Safety Equipment Institute is an independent third-party certification arm. So there are international standards for this. NOCSAE is an international standard setter by virtue of ANSI. The American National Standards Institute certifies us or accredits us, if that's the right term. A Safety Equipment Institute is an accredited third-party entity for certification, which means they can't be bought. They're completely independent. They follow very strict certification guidelines, which includes quality control. So the Safety Equipment Institute will actually come into your facility, ask a whole lot of questions. You better have the right answers. They want to look at your quality control. They want to randomly select products off the shelf and send them to an independent laboratory to test them. That's a very, very good program. And I'm going to tell you a funny story about how that started. And it's almost an embarrassing story as the technical director of NOCSAE. We had language in the standard that said products shall conform to the standard with statistical significance, meaning statistically, they all have to pass. Turns out that if you're an English major, statistical significance might not mean that. We had a new helmet manufacturer that started manufacturing helmets. We started testing them. We found out that about 40% of them failed. And we said, hey, man, your product doesn't work, or does it say I have to meet the standard? Well, it's statistical relevant. He goes, 60% is relevant. And we went, damn it, he's right. Excuse me, but yeah, he's right. So we said, all right, the standard shall be with 3 standard deviations. And we wrote a whole protocol on what statistical significance means to us. And that was SEI's job, is to make sure that those products meet the standard to that level.
Yeah, that's crazy. Does a few last questions. carbon fiber, we're involved in the sail world in the summertime. Carbon fiber is obviously a huge factor in sail racing. You can do things with carbon fiber. Does the research and development and the standards you're setting literally change because there's such a change in the technology over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, I think it does. Interestingly enough, with the human body, capturing the wind and maybe making. I mean, I have a bass boat with a carbon fiber hull, and it goes very fast, and it's very stiff, and it's very much fun. Carbon fiber in helmet shells has been looked at. Sometimes the helmet shell can be too rigid, right? You want some deformation. Sometimes the chest protector could be too rigid. You want some deformation. So at this point, more plastic materials, and I say that in the engineering term of plastic meaning deformable, more plastic materials are usually better. But the development of certain foam materials, certain energy attenuating foams, now there are some 3D printable helmet liners that are quite exciting, not only because they fit differently, but their mechanical properties are interesting and can be controlled a little better. There are foams with a negative Poisson's ratio where when you hit them, they actually expand in directions where you wouldn't expect them to. So yes, technology changes. Certainly the standards need to keep up. But interestingly enough, although you might initially think, I want the hardest exterior component to my shell, I want the hardest exterior component to my shoulder pad, chances are you really don't want those things. You want some compliance there. You want the energy to be attenuated over the whole system. So a sail, for example, a carbon fiber sail, for example, on a catamaran, you want no compliance. You want every bit of that energy going to the mast and eventually into the hull. And that's exactly what we don't want. We want those things to be flexible. So when it gets to the water, it's been attenuated.
It's the smallest things that too, I think you can see in development. We just purchased, like I said, a bunch of Warrior helmets, and they actually came in sizes. They have a dial system on the back of the helmet, which makes it a little easier to fit. And when you got kids in a high school or a college team, that some of them are 5'6" and some of them are 6'5", not every helmet fits the same, and you can't just kind of tie it. And I thought that was kind of cool to having the different sizes in helmets. And I got the largest melon in the world, and I put one of our helmets on, and it fit really well. I was really surprised at how well it had taken. And I think those are the innovations that I think you guys provide, which kind of leads me to my last question. Do you guys, it's like insurance. Nobody cares until you need it. And do you hear from friends, you're involved in the NOCSAE. Is it like working for the CIA, or is it just, do we have misconceptions of your organization? Do you have misconceptions? Do you have, cocktails with friends? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, it is a fair question that I have cocktails with friends. That's true. I do.
I don't think we know what your organization really is, and that's why we had this conversation today. And I'm wondering if you guys feel that way, or is that an installation that you don't really get to?
No, it's kind of interesting. Every now and then I'll have a coach or something go, yeah, you serve on that committee that sets the standards that keeps our kids safe. Man, I smile from ear to ear. But most of the time, I hear from parents, well, you're the guys that just make it more difficult for me to play the sport. I have to spend more money. And why do you guys do that? You must be part of the sporting goods industry. Well, we're really not. In fact, those guys don't like us much either sometimes. But I must say that the manufacturers involved with NOCSAE, they offer really good resistance. I mean, they don't complain about things unless there's a reason to, and they've often thought about stuff we haven't. So, we say the standard needs to do this, and well, you thought about this, that, and the other thing. Well, no, we don't make the product. We didn't think about this, that, and the other thing. And so there'll be some give and take there. But I think most people think that we're an organization that makes money from the sporting goods dealers or from those who make the product. And the fact of the matter is that's not how it works. Almost nobody's making any money with NOCSAE. It's almost all volunteer, or if I'm using my lab, I'm going to get compensated for that. So I get paid. If Mike is not being a lawyer and he's taking care of NOCSAE business, he gets paid. But everybody else is a volunteer, and about 80 or 90% of the money that comes in goes right back into research, funded research. We were, until the NFL decided that concussions were a problem, NOCSAE was the largest funder of head injury research in the world until the NFL got involved. So I pride myself on doing that, and we're kind of the unsung efforts in the background. And I'm okay with that. I just want athletes to be safe. I coach a mountain bike team. I want those guys to be safe. There's no reason to take unnecessary risks. I mean, if you're riding a mountain bike, chances you getting hurt is pretty big. If you're playing lacrosse, chances are you might get hurt. If you're skiing, I'm an old man. I don't have the skill set I used to have. I'm going to go ride a mountain bike this afternoon if it stops raining. And I recognize there might be some risk, but I know what those risks are. And at least I think I know, and I think I know how to mitigate them. Our kids don't know that. So they need an organization and coaches like yourself that yep, I can buy into this. I want to make sure these kids are as protected as they can be and still play the game correctly, which, by the way, is always the trade-off. You could put them in a knight of shining armor outfit. Commotio cordis is prevented by probably an old whiskey barrel strapped to your shoulders. Pretty hard to play the game with that. Right. So it's, those are the situations. And yeah, so I don't think most people know what we do. I think most people don't appreciate the time and effort that many of the top sports physicians in the world and top coaches and top equipment managers and trainers. I don't think they know the time that gets put in around that table at absolutely no expense other than getting to the meeting, being compensated for their travel expenses, not for their time, that these guys put in. I mean, we're talking, some of the most notable names in those particular fields, both engineering and medicine. I mean, we have neurosurgeons that probably could make $3,000 a day coming to our meeting for free. And maybe 30,000, maybe the number is 30,000. I don't know what a neurosurgeon makes, but I know one thing for sure. He's not making any money with sitting at the table with us, but he wants to be there to make sure that we're doing everything that we understand that we can do.
I think the organization was one that was just, you always knew it was there. And then I think 3 or 4 years ago, STX and Cascade got into a helmet war with your organization as to how it was going to be funded. And some companies had to go back and forth and they didn't do what they were supposed to. And then all of a sudden it sort of became front page lacrosse news. But I think back all the way when I was a kid, I played the first 5 years of hockey without a mask because nobody wore helmets. Nobody wore masks. My dad played for years, never wore a helmet. I wouldn't think more to play, go skiing without a helmet now than the otherwise. And having been around the numbers of the doctors with U.S. Lacrosse Administration and listening, that's kind of why I wanted to interview you. We interviewed the 2 manufacturers, the R&D guys from the 2 companies, and now we're putting the sort of the – you can disagree, you can argue and all the rest of it, but there's some good information that I think it's one of those things that just people don't understand. And I think that's something that I do really appreciate your time and being able to take and explaining it to our audience.
Not a problem. Glad to do it.